Welcome to The Learning Core, a podcast by Telos on the Telos channel. Together, we'll interrogate the core issues of conflict with experts from around the world and uncover the path forward toward creative action in our communities. My name is Sarah Sturm, and I'm your host. Today, we're continuing our series of conversations about nonviolence. At Telos, we believe that active nonviolence promotes freedom and justice and is grounded in a spirit of love and hope. Creative and clear resistance against all forms of violence, direct, structural, and cultural, heals our world and paves the path to reconciliation. Just peacemaking is a courageous, countercultural, and purpose-driven way of life. For this conversation, I'm joined by Noam Shuster-Eliassi, an Israeli comedian and activist who models why relationships across lines of difference are foundational to peacemaking, as she uses humor to call out violence and injustice and invites us into an embodied vision for mutual flourishing. Noam writes and performs fluently in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, and she frequently touches upon her experiences growing up in Neve Shalom Wahat al-Salam, a mixed Jewish-Arab community. Her videos have gone viral in several Arab countries, and in 2018, Noam became the first Jewish performer to perform in the Palestine Comedy Festival. Her live show received a 4-star review at the 2023 Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and a documentary film following her live performances, produced by Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Rachel Leah Jones and directed by Amber Ferris, is expected to premiere in 2025. If you've listened to any of our Telos podcasts, you've probably heard me talk about cultural violence, the logics and stories that make structural and direct violence seem normal and justifiable. For me, Noam is a great example of what the opposite of that can look like. So instead of cultural violence, using culture to build peace. Welcome, Noam. We're so glad to have you joining us today on the Learning Core podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You grew up in a really special place called Neve Shalom Wahat al-Salam, which is a unique village and community. I'd love to start by inviting you to share a little bit about where you grew up, where you come from, and how it influenced the way that you relate to everybody in Israel-Palestine.
Wow, I think growing up here and being raised here became like a source and kind of like the DNA of everything I do. I like to say that it started from my parents because they made the choice as, leftist hippies to raise their children in a different way from if I would have been raised anywhere else in Israel. I don't think my life would have looked the same. So Neve Shalom Wahat al-Salam started in the 70s. By a few spiritual leaders, mainly Bruno Hussar, who was an Egyptian Jew who converted to Christianity and came to the Holy Land to kind of start a vision. It started as an interreligious vision. He wanted Jews, Christians, and Muslims to live together in the same piece of land. And then when families actually started arriving to Neve Shalom Wahat al-Salam, in English, the Oasis of Peace, it's right by the Latrun Monastery. And, we live like by I think you've been here, right? You've visited. So it's like a hilltop next to the Latrun Monastery. And when the village started, when families started coming here, the families told Bruno and all the other spiritual leaders, we're happy to be the vision of this place, but it's less about Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It's more about like two people, two nationalities, Jewish Israelis and then Palestinians. Palestinian meaning Muslim and Christian Palestinians. And my parents came here with the Oslo Agreement. So in the 90s, right after the first Intifada, they were already quite involved politically, and they wanted their children, me and my brother, to grow up in a different way. And, so my memories from my childhood go back to seeing my parents kind of very similar to where we are today, where there is like no hope and no prospect for the future. My father spent time in Israeli military detention for refusing to serve in the occupied territories and in Lebanon. And as a little girl growing up and seeing my dad go in and out of military prison. And then a few years after, there is the Oslo agreements, and they come to live in this oasis of peace. And suddenly my best friends are Palestinians. And, my childhood didn't look very much like a normal Israeli girl's childhood. And the fact that Palestinians became my neighbors, my best friends, my teachers, basically part of my DNA. I think it changed completely the trajectory of my life and my understanding of this place and this land, our history, our present and our future. And Arabic became a second language to me, and Israeli Independence Day is no longer just Israeli Independence Day. It is also the Nakba, the catastrophe day of my Palestinian friends, neighbors. This just builds up an entirely different way of life on this land. And so I think I relate this experience to every single aspect of my identity, whether it's my Ashkenazi side, my father is Ashkenazi, son of Holocaust survivors, or my Mizrahi side, my mother was born in Iran, I'm Mizrahi family. And on top of that, I grew up with Palestinians here in Neve Shalom, and I think that my way of relating and my way of understanding all of the different aspects of my identity was really shaped by the multilingual, multinational, multicultural way that I grew up.
I always love hearing about communities like this because for us at Telos, one of the foundational principles is that relationships across lines of difference fuel transformation. And the communities we come from, we have a responsibility to. And just hearing you talk about today and in the past, growing up side by side with Palestinians or with other folks who believe that a different shared future is possible, that the way the world is now doesn't always have to look like this. Creating those pockets of community, living out how we want the bigger world to be, is such a powerful way of controlling what we can control, influencing what we can influence, even as we try and do the bigger work beyond just our neighborhoods and our families. And so I think it's so hopeful for not just me, but so many people to see this, to not just hear people talk about wanting to coexist and live together, but to see this happening, to see those relationships, and to know that not just this other world is possible, but there are places where it is beginning now and has already existed.
Yeah, once you live it, you're exposed to the internal criticisms and difficulties and the problems that this type of place brings with it. The experiment itself as a coexistence experiment has its issues and its obstacles and its imperfections and its flaws. But I think that for most of the people who choose to come here, yeah, it's a choice where you're saying, I'm not just joining a project or an afternoon program. I'm actually designing my life to be completely different.
Yeah, it makes me think of the Martin Luther King Jr. quote that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people, that how we live our lives takes a lot of courage and faces a lot of backlash. And I want to touch on some of that backlash later, but I want to ask you a little bit about comedy first, because I think for a lot of people, nothing is funny when it comes to Israel Palestine, right? Some things are too important to take seriously, though, and there has to be joy amongst the tension. So, why is comedy the tool that you now use for your activism? How did you get to this point where that's how you want to shake up assumptions, to do the work that I will say of peacemaking, even though you came from more of a traditional policy UN background?
I think comedy, first of all, it's very hard to do comedy these days here. It's been tough for, I don't know when the podcast will be launching, but as of now, it's almost 11 months. It's been really, 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 really tough. On the one hand, people need it urgently and are kind of thirsty for laughter, for any kind of distraction, and on the other hand, it's very, very hard to make fun and laugh about anything right now with the hell that we're living in and the destruction and the really misery and the trauma that everyone is experiencing here. For me, though, I feel like I am marinating on a lot of material right now. And there will be a time, I think, hopefully soon, when I will be more, I will be more ready to release more and to go back to being the, the comedian. It's just the fear and the trauma right now. It's really, really heavy on the heart, and it's hard. But still, I do shows and people come to the shows. I had a show with a Palestinian spoken word artist where we did like spoken word and stand up, and people came up to us and they said, "Oh my God, we needed this laughter right now more than ever." And so it's like you're learning to live with the contradictions of doing comedy during this time. And for me, comedy is a way to uncensor myself or to not be afraid to say things, even though sometimes fear is numbing. I used to be like, used to do a lot of like straightforward activism and a lot of peace building. And I was working in the UN in a really, really unique program where we were actually working with a lot of extremist right-wing Israelis to try and bring them closer to a solution, or learn about the Palestinians, or go to Northern Ireland to hear about how they did the Good Friday Agreement over there. And obviously I failed miserably, and like the writing was on the wall a long time ago about the extremism that is rising in Israeli society, and we were trying to fight it. And the UN was just so scared. And when I was kind of like in the last months in the UN, I just grabbed the mic in one of the conferences and I started doing comedy. And after a few months, I was also invited to be the first Jewish comedian in a Palestine comedy festival. And being able to use my languages and the different contradictions in my identity that I acquired from growing up the way I grew up in different festivals and on different stages just made me really like worship comedy, because it's endless, it's limitless. You can, write jokes in the afternoon and go on an open mic that same evening and perform them and see what works and what doesn't. And you can express yourself, in such a straightforward way that for me, just comedy became the tool that I used to shift and shake the power structures here.
One of the things I love about your comedy in particular is that it doesn't punch down. It doesn't make fun of other people. And I think the flip side of comedy sometimes is that it can be used to otherize. And yours always points towards collective liberation. It invites other people in. And I think for me, part of why I find you so spot on and so funny in a way that is very freeing from the weight of this work is because you make structural violence visible, you make cultural violence visible. So rather than laughing at people, it's laughing at a situation that isn't funny and the internal ironies and the things that in reality are absolutely not funny, but when you point out just make no sense. And so I'll put some links in the show notes for this so folks can try and see some for themselves, because laughing at the structural violence, even as we try and transform it, sometimes is the only way to make this work sustainable.
Yeah, thank you. I never really think of it that way, because I'm always like, oh, can't you just be that comedian who makes fun of this and this and that, and like the, you know, like marriage and personal life and this and that. And I'm always trying to find a way through comedy to talk about the explosive issues here. So thank you for acknowledging it.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the reception that you've encountered from Israelis and Palestinians, because as someone who lives in complexity and community, that's hard, right? People often want you to put yourself in a binary of us versus them. And in the work of peacemaking, of collective liberation, part of that work is breaking down the us versus them mentality, but that comes at a cost. And I'm wondering if you can share about how this has been received. You mentioned that you were invited to a Palestinian comedy festival, right? Not everyone gets that honor, especially as a Jewish Israeli comedian. So how has the reception been towards you and towards this work in those different communities?
I'll start with Israelis. I think, I mean, I am by no means accepted or even tried to be popular among like mainstream Israeli audiences. It's just not my goal, not my intention. Sometimes things have, gone viral, and there was interest, and I was like, oh, okay. But it's never really my passion or my intention, because I know that once the mainstream Israeli audiences listens to my experience, there's a lot of rejection and a lot of like a lot of like, come on, we're here to listen to stand up. Tell me something about like your credit card or like shopping or like things that like relationships, like, you know. And so I feel like I still have work, or maybe in the future, or maybe, you know, I don't know if I'll ever be accepted in the like Israeli mainstream comedy scene. Especially since October 7th, I realized that a lot of the collaborations and a lot of the colleagues that I thought I had, they were doing such disgusting, racist, anti-Palestinian comedy, you know, making fun of the most vulnerable people. A comedian I used to sometimes try out material in his comedy lineup was making fun of Gazans who were drowning or getting killed by the aid packages, the humanitarian aid packages that were thrown from the helicopters and the airplanes. And, you know, and I thought to myself, this is supposed to be my comedy colleague. This is disgusting. And so I also don't really have a desire. I mean, of course, I want to change hearts and minds of Israelis to make them less racist, to diffuse the extremism, to speak about my experience to Israelis so that they know that if I grew up with Palestinians and my life looks so different, that it is possible, blah, blah, blah. But right now, it seems very impossible. The spaces that I thought I did have in Israel are shrinking and shrinking. And then there are the Israelis who are really eager to hear my voice and are coming to the shows that I have with Palestinians and want to hear more and are following endlessly and want to soak up every bit of material. There is that as well, but those spaces are shrinking. In terms of Palestinians, I mean, Palestinian audiences are they're the most amazing. Like the Palestine Comedy Festival, the first time I performed there, I left the stage crying from happiness because of the way that I was received. The fact that I'm a Jewish Israeli comedian who does comedy in Arabic and doesn't use it to like do like PR for Israel or to be a spy in the Mossad. I'm actually doing it to expose some of the wrongs and the injustices that Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And I think that throughout the time I really gained, you know, I gained so many colleagues and so much love and so much appreciation and love from, you know, Palestinian audiences. Now it's very, very difficult because Palestinians as a collective, they are mourning what is happening to their people in Gaza. And I just don't feel like it's the right time for like an Israeli comedian to, but still like I'm doing what I can, and I try to be the best ally and the best advocate. And I don't know, I mean, I have shows sometimes, but it's not in the scale that I had before. And hopefully, you know, with time, I will be able to, you know, to get back to it. But I think, you know, in terms of the way that I was received with Israel, it's with a lot of suspicion. And also there is some suspicion from Palestinians, but also a lot of excitement and acceptance.
Yeah, I think post October 7th, one of the things that a lot of people who work in this space have experienced is this reduction back into binaries of us versus them. Whether it's there's only space for us to grieve what happened on October 7th, or there's only space for us to grieve what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank since. And so for people, I will say like you, who want to hold space for all of that, right? Who care deeply about your Israeli friends and colleagues, your Palestinian friends and colleagues, who are trying to make this space that I would say is rooted in what Telos calls mutual flourishing, a belief in freedom, dignity, security, human rights for Israelis and Palestinians in equal measure. That space, that desire has shrunk a little bit. And I'm wondering if you are interested in, no pressure, to share a little bit about the experience of trying to advocate in this space post October 7th and how isolating and lonely it is. I don't want to put that on you, but from what I hear from not just you and other people, right, how that space has shrunk. And then the second part, what those of us who care about building a space for mutual flourishing can do to come alongside you all in support to make your work on the ground there easier.
It is hard and nearly impossible. I mean, it's just I think, first of all, the amount of pain, the amount of grief, the amount of loss, the amount of unbearable, unspeakable like cruelty and pain. And I don't think we quite yet understand the scale. You know, we didn't even have one day to pick up the rubble to understand what's going on, because we are so busy surviving every day. And every day, like 700 different things, you know, come our way in terms of how, you know, the cruelty in the situation, you know, in Gaza, with the starvation and displacement and the death toll, and, you know, here in Israel with also people displaced from the north, the south, hostages. And I think this is kind of like what the Israeli government is counting on the most, this survival mode and this kind of us figuring out how to go day by day. Not to talk about, you know, people who are Palestinians inside Israel who have families in Gaza who have lost contact with them since November or something, who are just waking up every day not knowing what you know what happened to their families. And it will take such a long time for us to even understand the picture. And so while we are going through these horrible times, you know, I've been protesting, I've been writing and posting, and to the best that I can, you know, sometimes performing in the spaces that are left for us to perform in. And it's becoming more and more and more difficult. Also, I feel like I'm out of words. Like every day that passes by, it's like all these obvious things that we've been saying, that a ceasefire will happen eventually. So why are we wasting all these lives? Why there is so much misery if we know that ultimately there will be a ceasefire? And then, you know, realizing that the Israeli government prefers to continue bombarding the Gaza Strip rather than saving hostages. So the destruction of Gaza and Hamas is something that the Israeli government prefers rather than saving its own citizens. And I think this example is really a microcosm of our lives here now, where there is absolutely no value to human life, and there is absolutely nothing that we can do as activists, as advocates to change it. It's like you see the most amazing activists and the most amazing protests and the most amazing like help. You know, I have a friend in Gaza who's a film director, and his son, he has 5 children, and his son had to go through like an eye procedure, and his family needed so much help. Within a few hours, I was able to collect enough funds for him for like the eye surgery and like essentials for his entire family for 3 months worth in the Gaza Strip. And the, you know, the quick way in which people were so responsive in helping, like there is such a huge contradiction between the human material that we have here on the ground and the powers that are just suffocating us and not letting us bring into life the amazing human material that exists here. I truly don't know. I mean, I know, you know, from the outside, for you listeners, for, you know, and anyone who's listening to this, I think there needs to be more pressure from the outside. I think the voices that need to be amplified are voices that are not busy polarizing and dividing us. You should be amplifying voices that are trying to build something and not just criticize something. And really, like, more and more pressure on Israel to stop, you know, the massacres, the starvation, the displacement, you know, to bring back the hostages, to do everything that it takes to save the life that remains. I think it's clear to everyone by now that like Netanyahu is really counting on the continuation of this to save his seat. And there are such horrible, horrible humans in his government, you know, really bloodthirsty. I mean, truly like I don't know what kind of an ideology it is that you prefer, a piece of land that you prefer to sacrifice, soldiers and people and hostages in order to continue this like ongoing bloodshed, instead of focusing on agreements and saving lives and repairing the trauma that we live in. And so I think that criticism and pressure on this government are so needed, and advocacy for not just a ceasefire, but a longer term end of the occupation, to make sure that Israel stops its aggression. I mean, it's just beyond words, the destruction and what the world has allowed Israel to do to Palestinian lives everywhere. And we need more and more and more and more pressure. And yeah, I mean, there is so much more to say, but on an immediate level, this is what comes up.
I think that's the invitation to all of our listeners and those in the Telos network who come predominantly from the United States, right? Our government is incredibly complicit in enabling what is happening in Gaza and in perpetuating injustice beforehand. And part of what we can do, if we care deeply about the stories we hear from our Israeli and Palestinian partners and friends, is advocate within our own country and to our own government. I'm sure all of you can hear, right? Noam said you are out of words, right? The words have not been enough. So everyone has a voice, right? No one is voiceless. Yeah, it's our turn, our continued responsibility to continue elevating those voices like yours, who have led the way, who have said this is what we need to stop the violence now, but also to transform that deeper violence and the occupation, all of that. And so our job isn't just to listen to those, it's to amplify those, to elevate those, but then also to take strategic action ourselves to try and actually do what we need to do to end the violence so that Israelis and Palestinians have that space and time to mourn, to grieve, to process. One thing that always sticks with me is the idea that you can't have post-traumatic stress disorder if the stress that caused the trauma is ongoing, right? So for so many people in Israel-Palestine, when the trauma is relived every single day, there's no way to process it yet. And I think one of the jokes that you said that, again, is absolutely not funny, but yet was so accurate, was that from the river to the sea, we all need therapy. And I think that idea of there needs to be space for the people who have experienced this harm, this violence, and who live there to be able to take care of communities and to take a pause and to do what you all need to do. In order for that to be possible, those of us who care and yet aren't on the ground have to step in and keep amplifying, keep elevating, keep advocating, especially when in our day-to-day lives, we don't carry nearly the same costs that all of you do who are there on the ground.
Every word.
Noam, I think one of the things we talk about at Telos often is the idea that hope is what you do. And we've talked before in trainings, I'm not sure if we've ever done it on a podcast, that there's a difference between optimism and pessimism and hope and despair. Optimism and pessimism is how you feel about something, right? For example, I'm incredibly pessimistic about Netanyahu and the direction that the Israeli government is heading. I'm not optimistic that'll change anytime soon. But what's more important is this difference between hope and despair. Despair means we stop acting. It means we give into the belief that nothing will ever change, and we throw up our hands and say, khalas, enough of this, I wash my hands of it. Hope, on the other side, is that action, it's that what we do. And so I'm wondering for all of us, right, as we listen to this conversation, as we watch what's happening on the ground, as we feel so much despair about the scale of violence, what brings you hope in the sense of what people are doing, or what's the invitation for us to act in hope so that we don't fall into despair, because none of us can afford the luxury of despair right now?
I mean, I think, yeah, one of the aspects is that we do have no choice. I mean, there is no choice to give up, and say, that's it, I'm done. Because even if I choose to leave, let's say, and do my activism and my comedy from outside because it gives me more freedom of speech, it doesn't mean that I give up. My Iranian friends, artists and singers left Iran to do their art from outside, not because they gave up on Iran, but because they knew that they will have more freedom to operate and to spread their voices from the outside. So, that's a way of thinking of it. I think Palestinian resilience as well as Jewish history teaches us a lot about not giving up, about, hope. I hate to say this, but that suffering sometimes, makes you like so resilient, and that you have to go through so much in order for us to see like another day. And I think it's also true. We have to be prepared for the day that things will actually somehow work out, because everything escalated in one day. And just as everything escalated in one day, we can wake up and one day something will happen, like the conditions and the timing will happen, and we have to be prepared for that. During these like painful and harmful and very violent times, people like us don't get to be heard, because the people who are doing the polarizing and the violence, that's their time to shine. But I think after that, or when we will be able to see some horizon, people will turn to us. People will want to hear our voices. People will want to, to come to us and to ask, how do we do this? What's our political imagination? How do you imagine, like, how do we rebuild this? And then I will get the front stage. Like right now, there is not really a glamorous front stage for me, because I'm that crazy leftist who believes that Palestinians and Jews deserve like equality. But right now it's very, very easy to imagine something like this. So I'm in my room alone in the dark imagining it. But there will come a day where the haters and the violent, again, bloodthirsty people will go back to their corners, and then people like me will get more front stage, and then we have to be prepared to act, to speak out publicly about our dreams and our imagination and how things can look like different here. And so the work and the preparation is never done. It's never dead. The aspirations and the hope, you can kill many, many, many people, but you cannot kill hope. I mean, it sounds very cheesy and very cliche, but it is true. The moment people are being offered rights and equality and building a better future and forgiveness and a prospect for your children, for your future, you grab it with two hands.
Yeah, as we collectively lament what is happening now, what has been happening for decades, the underlying violence, that idea of imagining the world we want to see and acting to bring it about is such a huge part of this. And so, Noam, I'm so grateful for the time you took to talk to us today, both about the pain of this moment, but also sharing that vision for how and why the deeper work of continuing to transform societies, the structural realities, the way life in Israel-Palestine looks, why that's so important and so possible. So just thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I hope that everyone does go check out your comedy, because there's not much to laugh at right now in this current moment. And yet there are still those moments where something will just touch you, and it is lighter for a moment. And we all need that so desperately as we figure out how to sustain this work for ourselves.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work you've been doing in Telos. I've been a huge fan for a long time of the work you're doing, and I really encourage, people who are already part of Telos or are thinking of, joining. It is so crucial and important that if you are exposed to Israel-Palestine, you're exposed from such a constructive, justice-oriented perspective like Telos has. And I wish you were the original birthright for Palestinians and Israelis. Like, I wish everyone it would be mandatory, to go through your program. So I'm really thankful for everything you're doing.
That would be my dream. So to our listeners, come on a Telos trip. In the meantime, keep listening to the podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care.